All right, guys, today is the day you've been waiting for. We are going to answer the question once and for all, is the LS truly the best engine platform to build and modify, or would you be better off switching to something larger like a Gen 7 8.1 liter big block, which is also known as a boat anchor in some people's eyes. Now, I realize there's a lot of different ways you could frame this comparison, but for me, here's kind of how I thought of it. Let's say you had about $3,000 to spend on your Silverado and you had a couple choices. Either modify the existing LS or swap to something really big like a 496 cubic inch big block, which would make more power, which would be a more fun truck to drive, which would be quicker in the 8th mile, or which would be quicker 0 to 60. Well, today we're going to be answering all of those questions. I just happen to have two 2000 Chevy Silverados. One of them, the extended cab 2-wheel drive, which I call the ugly truck. That one, it has an 8.1 liter swap. And the other, the single cab step side, that has a 4.8 liter LR4. So these are kind of the contenders that we are comparing against each other. Now, the 8.1 has since been turbocharged, but all of our comparison data is going to be from when the truck was naturally aspirated. So our baseline was like 308 horsepower and 426 pounds torque at the rear wheels. And our goal is to see if we can get somewhat close to that for the same budget. Now, speaking of budget, yes, I could have easily turbocharged the 4.8 for about $3,000 and made way more power than the big block. But to me, that's not necessarily the most fair comparison, because you have a forced induction engine and, like, say with a turbocharger or something, you could just crank the boost up and make a ton of power. But that's not the fairest thing in my mind. To me, it's NA versus NA. But this build-off will continue because, just like we turbocharged the 8.1, we're going to be adding forced induction to this LS in the very near future, and we'll continue the build-off because this one is getting a forged increased displacement engine, 547 cubic inches to be precise. So in the spirit of things, this eventually will get a larger LS with stronger internals and will crank up the boost to the moon. But that's for another day. First, we need to see exactly what all of our efforts got us. So I just got back from the dyno with the modified 4.8, and if I'm being perfectly honest with you guys, I'm a little bit disappointed with the numbers that I put down. I think we're about 25 horsepower less than where I wanted to be, or where I think it should be, just based on, similar combinations I've seen and different people that I've talked to. Now, I do have a few different tweaks that we can try and easy modifications that will maybe make up for that lack in horsepower just by a little bit, but I am not going back to the dyno because for this to work properly, I've got to be the one controlling the dyno so I can do my data logging and my tuning on there instead of having someone else just do the pulls. because out of we did I think 2 or 3 pulls, and I only got one good run, because after I looked at the data logs after the fact, there was only one run where it actually got to 100% throttle the whole way through. But anyway, I digress. We have our data, and we have a benchmark to compare against, and we have some homework to do, so hopefully we can improve that number just a little bit. So remember, we're starting out with 208 horsepower, 229 pound-feet of torque from the bone stock 4.8. The bone stock 8.1 made 98 horsepower more and 199 pound-feet of torque more at the wheels. And that was kind of the benchmark I was going for. Because a lot of you guys, when I posted up that 8.1 swap video about a year ago, you're like, oh, the 8.1 is a, my favorite comment was, the 8.1 is a boat anchor and a complete waste of time and money, which, yeah, I'll give it to you. The 8.1 definitely does not have as much aftermarket support as some other engines like the LS does, but the 8.1 has a huge advantage in terms of displacement, especially with the 547 that we're building to replace the bone stock 8.1 in ugly truck. But anyway, that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're talking about the 4.8. So how much did it make at the wheels? Well, like I said, I'm disappointed, but it made 275 horsepower at 5,900 RPM, and it made, where are we at, 279 pound-feet of torque at 4,300 RPM. So looking at the two graphs, you know, kind of overlaid before and after, I'm happy with the characteristics of this, because when you look at the two torque curves, the stock one here and the aftermarket, or the modified version here, we didn't lose torque anywhere. We still get a nice healthy mid-range, which is awesome. And the red power curve, as you can see, it's also above the stock power curve everywhere, but then once you get up above like 5,000, 5,500 RPM, it carries a ton of power way up top. So I'm happy with the characteristics of it, because, you know, anytime you can do a cam swap without really losing low-end torque, that's a great day in my book. So that's good, but we're also, in my opinion, I feel like we should have made about 300 horse. You know, 295 I would have been happy with, but we're about 25 horse short. So I sent my tuner from Tennessee, Matt from Sky Performance, I sent him a log on the dyno, and he said, check 2 things. And the first one he actually told me to check before, when we were doing the tuning and I hadn't done it yet, and that was a restriction in the intake. So we're measuring that based off of the manifold air pressure sensor, the MAP sensor that goes in the intake. And with my elevation, I'm at like 4,700 or 4,800 foot of elevation here in the state of Utah. When I turn the key on but don't start the truck, we get a measurement of 87 kPa. Or if you're at sea level, you're at like 100 kPa, or if it's a cool day at sea level, you know, you get a little bit higher than 100 kPa. So basically that's kind of like, for me, 87 kPa is a perfect restrictionless intake, if that's actually a word. But under wide open throttle, when I looked at the data log, this truck goes down to like 81 kPa, which means there is a 6 kPa drop through the intake system. Matt said he'd expect like a 2 to 3 kPa drop would be about normal. I do have an air-aid intake tube on there, but I have the stock filter box, and my hunch, which we're going to try, is that the stock filter box is actually a little bit restrictive. I have another one here, so I'm going to modify this one so I don't actually ruin my good one. But it draws in air through these 2 openings here, which actually kind of pass through the, I can show you on this truck, I guess, if you can see it. Maybe not. Anyway, there's 2 small holes in the inner fender well right through there, and that's where the engine gets all of its air from. And I think perhaps that air path that goes through here is kind of restrictive. So what we're going to do is just get the old trusty hole saw and punch a couple of holes through the bottom of here and let in a little bit more air. Now you do have to do that below the level of the filter, clearly, because if you go up here, you'll be letting in unfiltered air. And the question also was, you know, maybe the air filter is dirty, but I actually just replaced the stock filter with a new K&N filter, which actually made 0 impact on the pressure drop through the airbox. So we're going to try the holes, see if that makes a difference. And if it doesn't, I guess it just is what it is. I mean, there's nothing else I can really try other than completely converting to a, you know, like I say, a 4-inch intake, which might definitely help a little bit. But anyway, whatever. The next thing that we're going to try is the timing. On the final setting that we're at, we're running 29 degrees at maximum RPM, and at peak torque we're running about, I think, 26 degrees of timing. And I haven't actually, like I said, in an ideal situation, you have the thing on the dyno, you'd make back-to-back pulls, change the timing a little bit, and then measure horsepower. And if you pick up horsepower, then that's good for timing, or if you drop horsepower, that's bad. I'm not going back to the dyno, but we do have the mass airflow sensor, and if you look at the hertz output from the mass air meter, then that'll tell you very accurately if you've gained or if you've lost airflow. So what I'll do is I'll say pull 2 degrees of timing out of it. We'll go do a wide open throttle run. And if we make a higher number on the mass airflow sensor frequency, well, guess what? That means we made more power, and I'll be just a little bit happier. Or, you know, conversely, if I take away 2 degrees of timing and we drop a bunch of airflow, then that means we're down on power and the timing was pretty good where it's at. So let me modify this intake real quick, and we'll do a quick run before we touch the tune, then we'll play with timing a little bit. And then once we get that all squared away, we'll do our final 0 to 60 times to see how much quicker the step side is. Okay, so I got the modified airbox in, and yeah, it's got a bunch of holes in it now, so in theory it'll pull in a little bit of, you know, hot engine bay heat, but it's really no different than those cold air intakes that you buy with a filter that's just kind of sitting in the corner there. All the holes I made were on the front side and on the fender side, which was sort of in an attempt to just let the fresh air in from the front and not pull in, you know, engine bay heat. But anyway, I have the same exact calibration file loaded up in the computer. I've got my data log recording. And really all I've got to do now is just kind of stab the throttle, do a wide open throttle, you know, run all the way up through the RPM range. And if we notice, you know, the KPAs now are going to be higher than like 81, 82, then the Airbox mod worked. Or if the KPA stays the same, well, that means the Airbox was not the restriction, and it could possibly be the tube. Definitely don't think it's the filter, because that's one of those, you know, high flow can-end ones. So let's see what happens. So we're pulled over on the side of the road, and I'm just taking a look at the data log that we just captured, trying to see if those holes we put in the airbox are actually going to do anything at all. And it actually kind of seems like they made a slight improvement. Not significant, but it's a step in the right direction, maybe a little bit closer to that 300 horsepower that we're after. So this is the data log of the dyno runs that we took, and this yellow trace up here, this is throttle position. He didn't get to full throttle until 4,900 RPM. But at full throttle, he's at 84 kPa, and if you watch throughout the run, this purple number right here, it drops a little bit, 84, 83, 82, and even gets down as low as 81, although it does spike back up a little bit to like 82. So that's kind of our threshold, is between 81 to 82 kPa. So if we did any better than that, we freed up some restriction. So this is the data log with the holes in the airbox, and once again you want to watch this KPA number right here. Yellow is full throttle, so we start out the run at 86 kPa, which is actually a little bit higher than it was before. Drops down to 85, 84 a little bit, 83 for a second I'm seeing in there, 82. 82 is as low as it dips, but it kind of hovers right between 82 and 83. I could put a 1 decimal place in there to get a little bit more accurate, but basically, from what I can tell on this data log, we have a 1 kPa improvement or a 1 kPa reduction in restriction of our intake system. Now, I probably would have been better off to go with, like, say, a 4-inch intake tube with a conical filter instead of the aerate tube and the stock box. My theory was like, well, the stock filter will be isolated from engine bay heat, which it is, but it maybe appears to be a restriction. The only way I could tell for sure is if I did a test with a larger conical intake, just to verify that. If we get that kPa up to a full 85, then we'd definitely be freeing up some horsepower. We're trying to find out what is the optimal timing for this engine combination, and the best way to dial it in would probably be on the dyno, but the next best thing is using the frequency of the mass airflow meter. Now, on the very last run I did after modifying the airbox, we peaked at about 10,100 hertz on the MAF. So if the engine likes less timing, it'll make more power, which means it's moving more air, and therefore the mass airflow frequency will have gone up. So if we do this next acceleration run, if we make a higher reading on the mass air meter, that means it's making more power, and that means it likes that amount of timing. Or let's say we don't make that much frequency on the mass airflow sensor, that means it likes more timing. So that's how we're going to dial this in, basically finding out where peak power is by using the mass airflow sensor. So I compared like 2 to 3 RPM points with the new tune with less timing against the original tune with more timing, and I actually found out that the original tune with more timing made more power. Go figure, right? Well, the thing is, every engine combination is a little bit different. You have to dial in each one individually, but it's safe to say that the original tune that Matt made for me is making more power with more timing than less timing. So just to kind of give you a visual idea here, at 5,500 RPM, it made 9645 hertz with Matt's tune, and when I took out 2 degrees of timing, at 5,500 RPM, it made 9542, so about 100 hertz less of airflow at 5,500 RPM. And that holds true at 5,000 RPM and 6,000 RPM as well. So this truck likes more timing, but if it was a 6.0 or a 5.3 with a different cylinder head, every combination is a little bit different. Old school engines like a lot more timing, like 32 to 33 degrees. So the other thing I could do is just advance it beyond, but that would put us like 30, 31 degrees. I feel like that's a little bit much for an LS, but that's kind of how you dial in power to make maximum timing. So I'm going to flash in the original tune that Matt had with about 29 degrees at 6,000 RPM. It was like 27 degrees, 26 degrees at maximum torque, because it seems so far that that's the best combination for this engine. Okay, so now we're going to do some acceleration data just to get some real world numbers about how much quicker we made this truck. From the factory, on this very stretch of road, we did 0 to 60 in like 10.98 seconds, and an eighth of a mile in 11 point something. So basically it took an entire eighth of a mile to get this truck up to 60 miles an hour. Now, if that seems slow to you, consider the elevation where I live. The Draggy GPS box right now says it's about 5,000 feet of elevation, which means the air is a lot thinner up here, which means any engine is going to be making less power. So yeah, it will be a lot slower than if we were at sea level. And that is reflected in the dyno numbers as well. There's about a 16 or 17% correction factor. That's an SAE correction for the dyno at this elevation. Yeah, so if we did these tests, acceleration specifically at sea level, they'd be a lot faster. The dyno numbers, because they're corrected, in theory, they should be same no matter where you take them. But just kind of keep that in mind, higher elevation equals a lot slower times. Okay, so the second second run that I'm going to do, I'm just going to try to foot brake it a little bit to kind of come up against the torque converter to maybe get a little bit better launch. Kind of spun the wheels a little bit, but we're definitely quicker than we were before, so I want to see if we can get even quicker yet. So, see, I've got about 2,000. Up, spins. That time though, I'm happy. Okay, I'm gonna try one last run just to see if I can do better. Still spun. All right, guys, we're back at the shop. I've been crunching some numbers, and it's time we come up with a logical conclusion to this experiment that we've been conducting over about the last month and a half. We have 3 questions to answer. Remember, we posed those at the beginning of this video. Number 1, is the LS engine truly the best? Number 2, what would I have been better off doing, either modifying a 4.8 or installing an 8.1? And number 3, what engine choice would have produced a more well-rounded performance package for a pickup truck? So, before we answer those, real quick, let's talk about the budget and kind of how that broke down and exactly what did we gain for the amount of money that we spent. When I set out on the 4.8 project, I intended to spend the same exact $3,000 that I spent swapping the 8.1 into the ugly truck, but unfortunately that number crept up closer to $4,000. However, in the spirit of fair competition, I'm only going to include the amount of money that I spent modifying the 4.8 with parts that would actually make the engine either produce more horsepower or the truck accelerate a little bit quicker. So that budget includes things like the torque converter, the camshaft, the exhaust, valve train, and all of the above. So that number's like $2,900. For $2,900, what did I get? At the rear wheels, we gained 67 horsepower. Although maybe with the Airbox mod, we'll call that like 72. We gained 50 pound-feet of torque at the rear wheels. And my favorite part about this whole engine package is we didn't really lose any torque in the mid-range, and we gained horsepower everywhere, especially way up top in the RPM ranges. So the little 4.8 is still a pretty well-rounded engine. My favorite improvement here is the 0 to 60 time. We shaved 3.3 seconds off that. And then we shaved 1.2 seconds in the 8th mile and gained 9.5 miles an hour. However, if you look at the 8.1 comparison for dollars per horsepower, the 8.1 swap only cost $9.80 for every horsepower, where the 4.8 cost $10.69. And the 8.1 definitely wins in the torque category. Every pound-foot at the wheels only costs $7, whereas $10.50 on the 4.8. So, is the LS truly the best engine platform? Despite all those numbers you just saw, I'm actually going to say yes. The LS is pretty much king when it comes to, parts availability, the amount of modifications that you can do, and just overall performance options for anything. I mean, it's like the most common engine you can swap in the world. I'm still glad I built the 8.1, and I'm really happy with how the ugly truck is performing, especially now that it has a turbo. But aftermarket parts are not easy to find. They're out there. They do cost a little bit more money. The turbo kit for the 8.1, I had to build that 100% from scratch, where if I wanted to turbo the step side with an LS, I can think of like 5 different companies right now that make bolt-on turbo kits for the LS. So no matter how much I love the big block, the LS, I'm going to admit, guys, is still the best engine platform for high performance applications, hands down. Second question, those $3,000 that I spent, would I have been better off to swap in a big block, or would I have been better off to modify the LS like I did? That one I'm going to call a little bit of a gray area, because everyone would choose to spend that money a little bit differently. If I would have turbocharged the LS, I think we would have been way ahead of the big block in terms of performance. But I wanted to do a naturally aspirated versus naturally aspirated comparison. So we'll call that one 50-50. I feel like an 8.1 swap would have been fun, but I already did one, so we'll leave that up to you. Finally, what would have made a better performing all-around truck? Cam's modified 4.8 versus stock 8.1. Now, the unfortunate thing here is I didn't actually ever get any Draggy data from the ugly truck when it was 8.1 swapped, but before I turbocharged it. So this is just kind of my hunch going off of what I remember. I feel like the 8.1 truck would have still been a little bit quicker. It certainly wasn't optimized, but I think it would have been a little quicker than the Cam 4.8. Probably not by much, so we're going to slightly give that advantage to the 8.1. Now, here's the question that's probably the most important one of all, is what would I have done differently if I could do this build off all over again? Sticking with the LS platform, I think the obvious choice would have been to start with a larger engine in the first place. So rather than taking the 4.8 out and going through it and putting it back in, I should have put in like a 5.3 or a 6.0, which I know a lot of you guys are probably screaming at me right now saying, LT, we told you from day one, put in a 5.3, put in a 6.0, they're going to make more power. Which you're not wrong. I totally understand how that works, but that kind of illustrates my point a little bit, that the 8.1 does have its place. There is no replacement for displacement. I mean, that bone stock engine made 428 pounds of torque at the rear tire through stock exhaust manifolds, through stock catalytic converters with a stock air intake tube. I mean, that is a massive engine that makes a ton of torque. So I don't know, it's kind of personal preference, but if I had to do it again, yeah, I think with the LS truck, I would have done a little bit larger engine. Finally, where do we go from here? Both of these trucks are going to be built sort of parallel with each other in stages, and so that means the next thing for the step-side truck is some sort of a power rider. I do want to stick with a little engine just a little while longer to kind of see what we can do with it. I know a lot of you guys love turbo kits. I'm thinking about doing that, but I'm also thinking about some sort of a root supercharger, like maybe a Magnuson or an LSA swap. I think both of those are really cool options, especially something that makes a lot of torque down low, which will really help the truck out with an all-wheel drive conversion. Speaking of which, we are doing an all-wheel drive swap on the step-side truck. We're also going to be re-gearing it. I have some 430s left over from the 10 bolt that was in the ugly truck, so I know I can get some 430s for the front, so I might do that. I might do 411s, I don't know. That's just some things to kind of pay attention for. That's going to be happening in the near future. I think the very next thing that we're going to do on the step-side truck is the exhaust. I have a 4-inch tailpipe I picked up. This is a MagnaFlow part for Duramax. It should fit with a few little minor tweaks. I have a small resonator we're going to put in there as well. And then finally, after the step-side truck is done with the exhaust, we're going to be focusing on the ugly truck for a little while. I have some different suspension parts out back, Caltrax flip kit. We have a shock relocation setup we're going to be doing. I also need to get some sticky tires because if you saw my last video, or one of my last videos, we just put a new converter in this thing and it is an absolute beast now, and it blows the tires off from pretty much a roll. So we need more traction. We need to get this truck to hook up if we're going to make it even quicker how we want. That's a lot of information, guys. Thank you for watching. Do me a favor though, drop a comment. Let me know what you think about the whole LS versus Big Block comparison. Let me know what you would have done. How would you have spent $3,000 on your truck to get the most performance out of it? And finally, click the like button, subscribe to the channel. All those things help us out. So thank you once again. I appreciate you guys. We'll catch you again soon.